I'm going to talk about FDA, Center for Vet Medicine's activities related to antimicrobial resistance. The bridging the gap between animal and human health hits very close to home for us. CVM is one of the smallest centers in FDA and the only one that deals with animal health issues, and our dual mission is to protect human and animal health. So we are constantly struck with bridging that gap and balancing the risks and benefits. So again, this conference hits very close to home for us. We're going to talk about some of the things that we have done, are doing, and are hoping to do in the future related to resistance. We're going to go over a little bit of background, then we're going to talk about our current strategy, and then we're going to talk about a few ongoing efforts related to resistance at the end. There's several points of redundancy with points that have been mentioned by other presenters. I take that as evidence that we already are starting to bridge the gap. So some of this is reinforcing the points that have been made yesterday and even earlier today. The complexity of the issue, again, is a primary point of frustration, an obstacle that we have to work around to implement public health benefits here. In particular, separating out naturally occurring versus acquired resistance. We really don't have much hope of mitigating the risk associated with resistance that's there already. What we're looking at affecting is the proportion that's related to acquired resistance, related to resistance that wasn't there to begin with. So teasing that out from what already exists is a confounding factor. But we do, FDA CVM does, our policy is that use in general is one of the primary drivers of acquired resistance, and that all uses, whether they're in human medicine, in veterinary medicine, in plant agriculture, hand sanitizer, even the mats as I was coming in at the airport today were antimicrobial mats. There's a lot of things that we do in our modern society that potentially have an impact on resistance, and we have to account for all of these, and particularly the most important contributors to resistance if we're going to have a positive effect. There's many gaps in our understanding. There's many questions that remain unanswered. There is a systemic lack of certainty about many of the issues, at least as we move beyond the fundamental that use is a driver of acquired resistance. After that, it gets awfully fuzzy, and the science is continuing to evolve. We're constantly finding new and unexpected things related to resistance. FDA CVM is taking the stance that even though there's a lot of unknowns still, there are some things that we can do to help mitigate the risk, and again, to balance the human and animal health. And again, this has been debated for decades. Almost as soon as penicillins came into use, it was acknowledged that resistance was developing as a result of those uses. And this has been debated in public, in the scientific community, in Congress, and the regulatory community for the better part of half a century. And so my slide says rather than continue debate, I would edit that on the spot to while we continue the debate. We're not going to stop the debate, to be honest, but while the debate continues, while the discussion continues, ideally, we're trying to identify measures that can address the public health concern, balancing that with the animal health issues. So here's some things that we have done, and again, over the past several decades. Back to Dr. Apley's comment about correlation and causation, this timeline appears to come at a spot where the pipeline dried up for antimicrobials. Our timeline for activities kicks in. I'm not sure if that's correlated, and if it is causal, I'm not sure what direction that might go. But since the late 1980s, all new classes of antimicrobials that were approved only under prescription or VFD status. Previously, all antimicrobials in vet medicine had been over the counter. So this was a shift, again, that happened in the late 1980s. That being said, there weren't a lot of new products that were coming on the market at that point. Most of the products were already on the market, and therefore many of our veterinary antimicrobials are over the counter. In 1996, as was mentioned, the National Antimicrobial Monitoring System was established, and shortly after, as was also mentioned yesterday, the extra-label use of fluoroquinolones were prohibited based on a signal detected in that surveillance system. And in 2013, FDA established a framework for assessing antimicrobial resistance as part of its approval process. Previously, as was mentioned by Dr. Goldman, there wasn't a formal process for evaluating antimicrobial risk. Predominantly, the focus had been on residue risks. To slightly clarify, and again, I agree in some respect with what Dr. Apley said earlier, that there is a absence of an ability to do a risk-benefit analysis in our approval of food animal drugs, at least when it comes to the human risk. There is a target animal safety versus efficacy, so we do evaluate the risk and the benefit to the animal when we're approving these drugs. But the food animal drugs have a quirk that we don't see in companion animal medicine or in human medicine, in that we have a food safety consideration as well, and that consideration is purely a risk assessment without a we don't balance essentially risk to the human to benefit to the animal for the food safety aspect. So again, a slight clarification, but in 2003 this was a formal established framework for, again, evaluating new products that were coming on the market, with the disclaimer that most products were already on the market and had been for decades. So there was the concern that these products that predated that 2003 Guidance 152 framework for assessing antimicrobial risks, that these existing products, there were concerns about their safety. Another point that may be worth clarifying or emphasizing, FDA, we're on the executive branch. We are enforcing the law. Somebody else writes the law. We're enforcing it. So the law doesn't come from FDA. Regulations come from FDA, and that's our attempts to clarify how we're enforcing the law. To be distinguished from our guidance documents, which are not regulations, are not enforceable by law or otherwise, but are a cooperative attempt to work with our regulated industry. It's important to note that the industry that we regulate is the drug sponsors primarily, and is not food animal agriculture directly or veterinarians directly, but indirectly through the drug sponsors and the products that we approve. That's how we enforce the law. What we wanted to do with our recent activities over the last 10 years or so is to take a look back at the products that had been approved, again, over decades and decades before our recent systems were in place, and to ensure that these products were modernized, their conditions of use were modernized according to our current understanding of the safety concerns. A few examples of these recent activities are the withdrawal in 2005 of venrofloxacin, fluoroquinolone use in poultry. And in 2010, the initiation of our current strategy through publication of the Draft Guidance 209, and in 2012, as was mentioned, the prohibition of certain extra-label uses of cephalosporins. In the middle of this talk, I'm going to focus on our current strategy, which is essentially summed up in three documents, really, 2 guidance documents and 1 regulation. Again, the guidance documents are not regulation, are a cooperative portion of the strategy, and then there's a regulation portion of the strategy, which is intended to streamline and facilitate adoption of the principles recommended. So in 2010, we kicked off our current strategy with publication of the Draft Guidance 209. This described our overall policy direction. We received public stakeholder input from a variety of stakeholders, public health groups, food animal agriculture, drug sponsors, consumers directly. We got a tremendous amount of feedback on this initial draft guidance, published it in final form in spring of 2012. What we're trying to do is initiate steps, again, start the process of assuring that drugs that are important in human medicine are used as carefully, as judiciously as possible. Again, our dual mission is to protect human and animal health, and we want to make sure that these antimicrobials continue to be available to combat disease in animals. And this includes treatment, control, and prevention. As Dr. Apley mentioned earlier, that prevention is an important use in animal and veterinary medicine, and that our belief is that any of these therapeutic uses can be judicious, and they cannot be, and we need to make sure that we preserve the uses that are appropriate and minimize the uses that are inappropriate, with the goal of preserving the continued availability of these drugs, both for our children and for our animals. The principles of the strategy can be summed up in essentially 2 points. One is to limit the use of products that are important in human medicine to those that are necessary for assuring animal health. Effectively, this means not growth promotion, not feed efficiency, not production uses, so limited to treatment, control, and prevention. The second key principle is veterinary oversight, again, of these products, of these antimicrobials that are important in human medicine. As we mentioned, 209 is a policy, a strategy document. It states where we want to go, what we want to do. It didn't provide a lot of guidance on how we're actually going to go about doing it. So we got that policy statement out in 2010 in draft form and finalized in 2012. But we needed to get the nuts and bolts out there. We needed to describe what changes we'd actually want to be made. So along with the finalization of the policy statement document, Guidance 209, we published a draft, Guidance 213, which described our implementation of that strategy. Provided some definitions, what we meant by medically important, a process for drug sponsors, again, our regulated industry, to update their product labels. And an important point that came up, the possibility of new therapeutic uses and exactly what data would be required, what that process would look like for potentially adding new therapeutic uses, and a timeline for implementing these changes. So the first point is our definition of medically important, and again, we received stakeholder input on this, and FDA currently has a ranking in the 2003 guidance that we mentioned earlier, 152. There's a ranking of drugs according to their importance in human medicine. So the decision was made to reference an FDA document that already established a distinction between drugs that are important for human medicine and those that aren't. So Appendix A of 152, so a portion of that guidance document has a ranking of drugs and classes of drugs, and a ranking, a 3-tiered ranking of those things: critically important, highly important, and important. For the purposes of this strategy, we decided to take anything that was ranked on that list, whether it's critical, highly important, or important, and to consider that medically important. Effectively, what that did is exclude a few classes of drugs that are used in veterinary medicine as essentially that had not been ranked as being important in human medicine. For example, the ionophores would be one of those drugs that were excluded from that ranking, and therefore weren't going to be the initial focus of this strategy. By pointing to an internally a document which. Did I do that? Yep. By pointing to a document that we have some control over, we can hopefully harmonize as we move forward and make compensatory changes as opposed to referencing another ranking, another system of ranking. For example, the World Health Organization has a ranking. OIE has a ranking. There's a number of other places that rank antimicrobials. They're very similar in some ways. The purposes are fairly different, and the fact that we have control over our current ranking allows for a little easier harmonization as things move forward. So we're getting to the bottom line, at least what it means for animal agriculture, what drugs would be affected by this strategy. As we mentioned, we want to focus on drugs that are important in human medicine. That's the main priority. We want to make extra sure that those drugs are used as carefully as possible. So that's the main criteria that we're focusing on. And again, those drugs, those classes of drugs that are represented in Appendix A of Guidance 152. Additionally, we're focusing on the feed and water uses. The production uses, again, as one of the first principles to move away from production uses and towards therapeutic uses only. The production uses are confined to the feed administration, so injectables and so forth don't have production uses approved for them. But feed and water uses are the two forms of medication that are most conducive to a large extent of exposure, to being applied to a large number of animals at the same time, and therefore rose as a priority, both because of the presence of growth promotion and feed efficiency claims in those routes of administration, and also their conduciveness to a large extent of exposure. As we again mentioned, one of the key principles was moving towards therapeutic use of these medically important drugs. So those products that have growth promotion claims on them would be affected, and those that are available over the counter. As you mentioned, until the 1980s, almost all of the antimicrobials were approved as over the counter, and any generic copies of previously approved products would be over the counter as well. So those products would be affected if they're medically important, ranked on 152, administered by feed or water, have an approval for a non-therapeutic or a growth promotion feed efficiency use, and are available over the counter. If, for example, we have medically important drug, for example, the fluoroquinolones, which we currently have, they're not feed or water use, so they wouldn't be affected. And they're already prescription in many cases, so those products wouldn't be affected. If we have a VFD drug, Palmitil, for example, it's already VFD, doesn't have a production claim associated with it, would not be affected by this strategy. It's already in alignment with our modern conditions of approval. Here's a list of some examples, and effectively looking through what drugs we currently have approved. These are the classes of antimicrobials that are medically important, have feed or water approvals, and are available over the counter and or contain production uses. Many of these are very familiar products. Many of them, as the point of this project, have been around for decades and decades. We received some very pointed stakeholder input that there was potential concerns associated with removing production uses of these products, in particular that there were unrecognized, or at least unrecognized in the approval, the old approval of these products, of therapeutic benefits of these production uses of these drugs, and therefore by removing the availability of these products for production uses, we would limit our therapeutic options, or there would be compensatory animal health negative impacts. And as we mentioned, CVM's dual mission is protecting human and animal health. Ideally, we'd like to maintain both at the same time and not sacrifice one for the other. We are probably not going to put animal health above human health, but as was mentioned earlier, we don't want to work to the detriment of animal health, in particular if there's no benefit to human health. So if we can have our cake and eat it too, if we can benefit human health and animal health at the same time, we will embrace the opportunity to do so. So as part of our implementation document, we've identified what it would take to potentially add new therapeutic uses to these products as these growth promotion claims are being removed. It's important to note here that at least for the feed uses of products, it's illegal to use medicated feeds in an extra label manner. And this is in comparison to injectables or even the water uses of these products, where it is possible to meet an animal health need and under the oversight and direction of a veterinarian to use these products in ways that have not been approved by FDA. There is a framework to do that, and again, carefully, there's some ways to do it rightly and wrongly. and some of our recent prohibitions are implemented at that point, restricting the extra label uses. It's important to note that the medicated feeds, it's illegal to use them in an extra label manner. So once growth promotion claims come off of the approved label, the veterinarian cannot even legally use those drugs for those purposes anymore. So it's particularly important to have animal health needs met in the approved conditions of use for our medicated feed products. So Guidance 213 describes a process for adding new therapeutic claims as we're removing growth promotion feed efficiency claims, including the data that sponsors, the type of data that sponsors, drug sponsors would have to submit in order to support those claims, safety and efficacy. Again, these are products that have been around for decades, so there's a lot of information about them. This isn't a new molecule that's coming on the market for the first time with very limited experience. So there is the possibility of leveraging existing experience with these products, both for safety and for efficacy. That being said, any new conditions of use would be expected to meet the modern criteria for approving these products, including demonstrating therapeutic effectiveness, first of all, and defined dosing durations and veterinary oversight. A timeline for this strategy was another important component. We wanted to ensure that there was a limited period of time and that this wasn't an indefinite process. But we also wanted to ensure that there was adequate time for FDA, for drug sponsors, for the animal agriculture industry to make changes. So this wasn't a light switch going off, which would be highly disruptive for everybody. But that we could implement this in a little bit more measured and deliberate pace. So we've proposed in the 2012 draft guidance, we proposed a 3-year implementation timeline that would start when 213 is finalized, which has not happened up until as of today. Along with that 3-year timeline for completing all the recommended changes, to give us an early indication, again, to help with our planning and to make sure that this moves forward in a measured and careful manner. We ask for drug sponsors to let us know within 3 months. So those are the 2 time points that we're, in terms of timeline, that we're asking for in our implementation. One is for sponsors to let us know within the first 3 months as to their intentions. Again, this is a collaborative effort, so we need to be working together early and often. And again, we're hoping for all these changes to be completed by the end of that 3-year period. Another benefit of the stakeholder input was the concern that shifting these products under veterinary oversight, in particular the medicated feeds under veterinary oversight. Again, Congress has given us a law that requires that any medicated feed that requires vet oversight is a VFD status, a veterinary feed directive status, and this is opposed to a prescription status, which the medicated waters and the injectables and every other product, every other route of administration is a prescription if it requires veterinary oversight. There's a separate law and regulation associated with medicated feeds that require vet oversight. The existing framework for vet oversight of medicated feeds is relatively recent, but has very limited, there's very few products that are currently VFD status. And several issues with widespread utility of this status were identified based on the existing provisions of that regulation. So as part of this effort, and in order to facilitate widespread adoption of the VFD status, simultaneous to implementing this strategy, we're updating our regulation. So again, this highlights the interplay between a voluntary collaborative approach through the guidance documents, through the policy, and through the implementation, which is very deliberately a voluntary strategy, so we can work together and do this in a way that works for all of us. We think that that's the most efficient and effective way to make these widespread changes. And in order to do that, we're making some streamlined changes to our regulation, which that portion would be not voluntary. This is a point of clarification. Vet oversight is one of the 2 main principles identified in our strategy, limiting the use of these products to those that involve vet consultation. To clarify, the idea is to involve the vet in the decision-making process. In many cases, this is happening already, but we want to kind of formalize that requirement that these products that are important in human medicine, that the veterinarian is involved in the decision making, mostly to minimize and preserve the effectiveness, minimize the risk and preserve the effectiveness of these products, both for the animals they're treating and for public health in general. As we said, practically, this essentially means moving from over-the-counter to prescription or VFD status. A little background on the VFD, which I alluded to. We don't need to dwell on that other than the timeline. Again, this is all relatively recently. This is in the less than 2 decades. So we have 100 years of antimicrobial experience. And honestly, the FDA's, the laws governing FDA are 100 years or less old. But some of these that are very applicable to what we're doing right now are a decade or 2 old at best. Mentioned our impacts and our concerns. The cost to the producers and the impact on the industry is inevitable in some respects with some of these changes, and we're attempting to minimize that to the extent that we can, while still preserving the benefit that we're going for, which is to limit the use of these products to those that are judicious. We looked at all the current requirements in order to update and streamline the VFD, and this included information that's required on the form itself. So this would impact how efficient it is for the vet to fill the prescription, what it takes to transmit that record, how long and in what form the various parties, the veterinarian, the producer, the feed mill, have to maintain those records, and the flexibility and specificity of that order. So our next steps, again, on these 2 things that are still up in the air right now, the implementation strategy, Guidance 213, and the streamlining to the VFD regulation. The comment period closed. We received public input that closed last summer, 2012. Both of these documents, they're the final version of 213 and the proposed VFD regulation, are currently at OMB. This is effectively the final level of clearance before these are published. Publishing these documents is our priority for 2013. We're still hoping that this can happen in the next month or so, and we're working with the clearance process to make sure that this happens. It's important to point out that publication of the final 213, final guidance 213, will start the clock. It will start that 3-year clock that we're asking for drug sponsors to make these changes within. It'll start the clock with 3 months. We expect to hear from them as to their intention, and we will be reporting publicly on our progress as we go to the extent that we can. There's some limits in terms of what we can report in terms of sponsors come in and start an application process, but we are aiming for as much transparency as we can legally provide through this process. 213 will finalize hopefully by the end of this year. The VFD will be in proposed form, so there will be another opportunity for public comment on the veterinary feed directive component. This is important, again, in terms of the conversation and continuing the dialogue. This is one more opportunity for stakeholders, public health and animal agriculture, and anyone else to provide further input on what this regulation looks like and whether it's meeting the needs to increase efficiency of that framework and still meet the public health goals that we're trying to maintain. As part of prepping for this implementation, and again, initiating the discussion, initiating steps. It's not the end of the discussion, but FDA and USDA, Dr. Dargitz here was part of a 5-state tour to areas that USDA had identified were particularly had limited access to veterinary services and therefore would be most impacted by the requirement that a vet be involved in the decision-making process. So we went to 5 different states through last spring, and we effectively presented our plans and what the strategy was, our version of what it looks like to us and what we're trying to do, and got feedback from people in these local communities on what the anticipated impacts are, possibly some adjustments that could be made to make this a little smoother rollout. And again, highlighting the fact that there is another opportunity for public feedback, particularly on the VFD component of the strategy. So that's what our current focus of our activities. That's what we're doing right now. We've talked about what we've done over the last decade or two. The judicious use strategy is what we're doing right now. And again, we're hoping that this clock starts here by the beginning of 2014. And there's a few other activities that have been mentioned. Dr. Goldman mentioned the NARMS enhancements. I'm going to talk about that very briefly. And then some enhancements to our data regarding the use of antimicrobials. Dr. Apley mentioned that previously. So FDA did receive comments that our resistant surveillance data, in particular, had some shortcomings. That in some respects they were not nationally representative, and that there were some sampling biases as a result of the HACCP sampling that Dr. Goldman mentioned, and that on-farm data was necessary for really tracking how the movement of resistance from farm to fork. So the NARMS partners initiated, again, ARS is handling 5 on-farm pilot studies. They're looking at the feasibility of on-farm sampling, a pre-harvest sampling, and looking at the variability or the differences between that on-farm sampling and the new implant sampling that was mentioned, started in March of last year, where we're sampling cecal samples as they're coming into the slaughter plant, as opposed to historically where we had end-of-plant sampling for the most part, with the goal of sampling that's nationally representative and sustainable. So that's the resistance data component. We're working on enhancing and making that better. There's an even greater need for improvements on our antimicrobial sales use data. In 2008, again, a congressional law was passed requiring drug sponsors to report and FDA to report total quantities marketed in a given year. And there's some restrictions on that, but since 2009, we've published these summaries of antimicrobial sales data. I believe Dr. Apley had a little clip of what that data looked like previously. There are some limitations to this data, and again, it's easy to pull up the numbers and put them side by side with use and talk about putting them together, but whether that is reasonable and appropriate is very debatable. In particular, the sales don't represent end use of these products. The distribution channels, particularly of medicated feeds, are incredibly complex. Not all product is ultimately used. There's also no way to distinguish in the vast majority of products how much is used in a particular species or even within a species for a particular indication. That was some of the reason and some of the benefit behind Dr. Apley's study, which he discussed in terms of sorting out exactly how much of these products are being used for production purposes. The sales data just do not give us that. There's also a confidentiality concern, a limitation that again is required by Congress, that we protect confidential business information. So that limits some of the information that we can present. The fluoroquinolones are a perfect example of a drug which is critically important in human medicine. Everybody's very interested in. There's only 2 sponsors that market it. Therefore, we are prohibited by law from publishing that information, which is frustrating for everybody. We can make use of that information internally, but the public cannot see that information. So as part of this recognition that we need better antimicrobial use data, in summer of 2012, this is again right after we published our final policy statement document and the draft implementation document, we asked for public input on ways to enhance our existing data related to the use of antimicrobials in food-producing animals. We asked for input on 3 particular questions. One was possibility of enhancements to existing sales distribution data requirements. Another one was the format of the presentation, how FDA is currently presenting their sales data. And the third major question were other opportunities to get on-farm use data. November of 2012, the comment period closed, and we've essentially taken 3 different tracks or we're currently pursuing 3 different tracks based on those questions and the input that we received. The first one is possibility of enhancements to our existing sales reporting requirements. And we're developing rulemaking, we're developing regulation that would possibly require sponsors to provide additional clarification or additional discrimination, for example, estimates of sales by species. Another thing that we're doing currently, and we've already released this for public comment, is provided a mock-up of some additional enhanced reporting of our existing sales data. This is stuff that we have right now and just reformatted in a different way within the confines of our legal requirements to protect confidential business information. What we've presented here in September, I think September 26th or so in the Federal Register is what we think is something that we can legally present to the public and is a potentially improved utility based on public input. The third question is a much trickier one and is one that I'm even more interested in, at least in the long term. And hopefully I'm offending Dr. Apley by referencing him several times because he was threatening to offend us, but I wasn't really offended, but but I take to heart the point, is a subtle point that he had in his presentation, that what we're going to do with this information, what analysis we're actually going to do is something that has been disturbingly absent from the conversation to me. Good experimental design, in my opinion, starts with what you're going to analyze. Before you design your experiment around your analysis, you don't collect your data and then see what you're going to do with it. That's poor practice, which is effectively all that we've been doing, all that anybody's been doing as far as I can tell. And through great pains, I'm sure for everybody else involved with me, we've been working with USDA and CDC to develop a collaborative proposal to collect additional information that would allow us to link antimicrobial use practice shifts to changes in antimicrobial resistance. Again, this has been a painful process. It was very clear to me, and I'm open for new information, but we were unable to find any example of an existing analytic mathematical framework that would allow us to analyze population level shifts in use and shifts in resistance. As far as I can tell, it does not currently exist. There is no analytic framework, as far as we can tell, for doing this analysis. And therefore, how do we design this program? Hopefully this isn't premature to announce, but as part of this work, we submitted an application for a NIMBIOS, National Institute of Mathematics and Biological Synthesis, a NIMBIOS working group to tackle this issue of developing an analytic framework. Again, bringing a collaborative group of people from a bunch of different areas of expertise, mathematics and biology, microbiology and population medicine and animal agriculture and others to attempt to develop an analytic framework. But currently, and please come up to me and tell me if you know of something which we've been unable to find, we've been unable to identify an analytic framework that would allow us to intelligently and rationally design a system to collect use that would be useful analytically. So while we're waiting for that to move forward, we're still, again, identifying, given our uncertainty, we're embracing our uncertainty and doing what we can with what we currently have available and attempting to identify what we can do right now to collect and enhance on-farm use information that, given what we know qualitatively at least, may be most useful in relating to shifts in resistance. With the intent of getting something in place and collecting additional data before the end of the 3-year implementation period of 2013, which, if that's finalized by the end of 2013, we're looking at having data in hand in 2016. So again, that's something that I'm particularly interested in, is frustrating and exciting and has great potential for disappointment as well as success, but that effectively gives the gambit of Center for Vet Medicine, at least on the animal side, and particularly on the food animal side, what FDA is doing related to antimicrobial resistance over the past several decades, right now, and then looking forward into the near future. I apologize for these web links. They're absolutely horrible. I was very jealous when I saw Dr. Solomon's web links yesterday that fit on one line. And I will be the first to admit that our website is not terribly user-friendly. But there are three parts in particular that are relevant to today's talk and are relevant to this issue. One, we have a relatively centralized source of information on our judicious use of antimicrobials strategy. And you can see things such as our public meetings and the current versions of these documents and so forth. There's also an FDA NARMS site. NARMS is a partnership between FDA, USDA, and CDC. Each of those organizations has their own NARMS site. CDC's NARMS site is shorter. The link is shorter, but I'd encourage you to look at FDA and USDA sites as well. Also, our sales data reports are currently on our website, and we have 2009, 10, and 11. We're in the middle of getting public input on our proposed enhancements to these reports, and once that feedback is complete, we're going to publish our 2012 data with these enhanced reports. So look forward to the next version of the sales data having a new and improved form. And over time, we're going to go back and update the 2009, 10, and 11 data based on that current approach.